We are not developing the human capital to support it. Everybody in the private sector knows this and says, oh, yes, human capital is everything. We don't provide a home for it anymore. So I think that sort of thing has to be addressed. Again, it's an enormous challenge now. The only person that is talking about something fundamentally different is Bobby Kennedy, enemies of the United States. Who are you? What are you? I do not support war with Iran. I do not support war with Russia. I do not want to go to war with China.
First, I think it's important for us to point out that the electoral process that we saw in 2020, which was deeply flawed, when you have more people voting that are actually registered, you've got a problem. And that was very definitely the case in 2020. You had a man that campaigned almost exclusively from his basement and won, on a level that we had not seen in decades. There's got to be a problem. Nothing has changed since 2020. So to assume that you're going to get an election now that is free and fair and honest, I think is a mistake. And so I caution people, we have not addressed the issues of electoral integrity. We've got to do that. We can do that. The problem is that for various reasons, the Uniparty doesn't seem terribly interested. And that tells you something about the level of corruption. So before we go into anything, what if and who could and so forth, let's be frank and honest. The damn thing that's coming up, if we do it at all, I'm still not entirely convinced that we'll have an election. I've also said that. We don't know what's going to happen over the next several weeks. As you pointed out shortly before this began, look what happened over the weekend. But before we do that, the audience needs to understand nothing of substance has really changed since 2020 in terms of how elections are conducted in the various states. So we have to expect ballot harvesting, ballot fraud, all sorts of problems associated with injecting numbers of votes into the system that otherwise wouldn't be there. We're still operating with this antiquated voter roll business, even though most American states specifically say in the Constitution only American citizens should vote. We know that doesn't happen. We have millions and millions and millions of people inside the United States who were not born here. We have over 52 million people living here who were not born inside the United States. How many of them will vote who are not citizens? We have large numbers of aliens who are legally here that get to vote. Remember the motor voter rules. You show up, you register, get your driver's license, whoops, you end up in the voter base. Well, what if you're not a citizen? Depending upon which states you go to. Oh, yeah, I know Gus, he's a friend of mine. I know Jose, he's a friend of mine. That's okay. This sort of nonsense is there, present with us. So whatever we say has to be viewed against the backdrop of what I consider to be a very flawed and corrupt voting system. So that's out of the way. Now, what do we think is going to happen? I don't know. I think, first of all, that we're going to have a problem with Kamala Harris as vice president, whomever she picks. What people don't understand is that both the Senate and the House have to confirm her nominee. The last time we went through this was with Richard Nixon. Some of your viewers will recall that Nixon's Vice President Agnew had to resign over tax irregularities. They had to pick a new vice president. That individual turned out to be Jerry Ford. He passed muster because Jerry Ford was a lackluster, vanilla character who had never offended anybody and also, as far as we could tell, never had done anything of significance in his lifetime. So he becomes vice president. Nixon resigns. He moves up and becomes president. Then Jerry Ford turns around and nominates Nelson Rockefeller. Well, Nelson Rockefeller did become vice president when they finally gave up and discovered that they could never figure out how much the man was really worth because he was worth so much they couldn't count it or quantify it. This time, there's no guarantee that whomever Kamala Harris picks will necessarily be acceptable to both the House and the Senate. The Senate, of course, is still dominated by the Democrats. The House is dominated by the Uniparty, but the Uniparty isn't reliable on this. You may have rhinos that decide they don't like the person that she's nominated, in which case you may go through more discussions and more nominations. So we got to be prepared for that kind of confusion and frankly, for that kind of crisis. What happens with the rest of it? It depends on what happens, frankly, not with Trump. Trump is probably going to get there unless Donald Trump, who is not, in my judgment, always in the best of health. He's grossly overweight. He hasn't taken care of himself. I notice that he is not nearly as sharp as he was back in 2020, and that's no surprise. As you get older, your mental abilities do not necessarily deteriorate, but they're not as sharp as they once were. Listening to him, that's quite obvious. He has a tendency to wander. He's not coherent throughout his presentations, and I think he falls back a great deal on humor to cover that. Then the question is, what happens with RFK Jr.? RFK Jr. is very much, I would say, at the height of his powers mentally. He's very much in touch with everything. He understands the issues, but he hasn't really had a chance. The entire mainstream media is against him. He's suppressed at every turn. If you were to put him on the stage with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, there would be no contest. RFK Jr. would be the standout winner. But is he going to get there? That's the real question. He should be there in September. But I don't know if that'll happen. Then could he win? Yes, he's got about 22%. Could he get more? Could he swing a third or 33 or 34%? Could he come out on top? I think it's a possibility. But there are so many obstacles in his way, it's hard to say that could happen. So right now, if you're a betting person in Vegas, you would probably put your money on Donald Trump.
Yeah, a lot of us were really impressed with RFK Jr.'s speech at the Bitcoin conference, and he talked on...
However, let's be frank. Here's a man who stands up, and I listened to both speeches, and I noted something that's very near and dear to my heart. He talked about the executive orders that he was going to sign, and then he discussed their content. Listen, there's nothing more important than that for a wannabe president of the United States, for a nominee to do. Back in 2016 and 2017, I was very engaged, certainly in October 2016, forwarding a couple of draft executive orders to the Trump campaign. Trump campaign was totally disinterested. Nobody looked at any of them until June of 2017. Now, why do I bring that up? Perhaps that was because at the time Donald Trump really wasn't convinced he was going to win. Who knows? But you've got to walk into office prepared. What are you going to do during your first 90 to 120 to 180 days? Everybody knows, based on historical experience, that a president of the United States has about 6 to 9 months during which he or she can achieve, I would say, 3, a maximum of 4 major objectives. Okay, so what are those 3 or 4? RFK Jr. can answer that. Donald Trump cannot. The one thing that Donald Trump says, which RFK Jr. also says, by the way, and has a plan to execute, is closing the border. Well, that's great. What else, Donald? Well, I'm going to, end the war on a phone call. Good luck with that. The Russians aren't going to pay much attention to that. The Russians will pay attention to actions, not words. Thus far, they've been promised repeatedly for decades all sorts of things. We haven't come through on anything. In fact, we've turned it around and we've been unambiguously hostile when there was no reason to be hostile. So the notion that you're going to get anything done on a phone call is a joke. And in the past, we know when Donald was president, he gave specific orders to people in the field to do things. I'm talking about Syria, I'm talking about Iraq, for instance, and Afghanistan. They didn't do them. These things were ignored. They were ignored by the military establishment. They were ignored by the State Department, the Foreign Service, the ambassadors, and so forth. You can't govern that way. So what's his team look like? Who's going to be doing what to whom? That's unclear. And it looks like an awful lot of the same people that were with him the last time are going to show up again. Well, based on that 4-year experience, I wouldn't have any of them come back. Now, maybe he doesn't care. Remember, he used to say he's the decider. What I decide is important. In other words, whatever anybody else thinks doesn't matter. Well, if he hasn't figured out during the first term that that's untrue, he'd better figure it out pretty quick. Again, Bobby Kennedy understands that. He understands that he can do these 3 or 4 things, but he also still has to build political support. He has to develop a consensus. He knows it has to be bipartisan. He also knows the limits of bipartisanship and is unafraid to act independently when he's called upon to do so. I don't think any of these things have been thought through by President Trump. I think President Trump desperately wants to be president. He wants to be vindicated. He feels strongly and with considerable justification that the election was stolen from him. That's fine. That's not enough. We need more detail. We need more policy analysis. He isn't giving it to us, and he acts like he doesn't need to. You know, I could shoot somebody at dawn tomorrow morning, and my base will stay with me no matter what I do. Okay, great. Good luck with that. I'm not sure. And again, combine that with the electoral process, too many uncertainties. So I would do business very differently. But, you know, that's Donald Trump, and that's his personality. That's the way he's approaching things. RFK is taking things very seriously. Listen to what he has to say about housing. You were impressed with Bitcoin, and so was I. I think Bitcoin, and people will castigate me left and right for saying this, and I don't care. Bitcoin is the future. We're going to end up with an entirely different monetary system from what we are accustomed to. We're at that strategic inflection point in human history. It's going to happen. RFK Jr. recognizes that. He's got a plan for it, but he also knows it's going to have to be adapted. Things are going to change. We know that. I don't hear any of that from President Trump, and absolutely nothing from the other side, from the sort of uniparty left that wants to stay in power in perpetuity. With them, it's, if you like what we've been doing for the last 4 years, please reelect us. We'll give you more wars. We'll give you more crises, more conflicts, more misery, more illegals, more criminality. Isn't that wonderful? This is DEI on steroids. This is diversity squared. Vote for us. Well, if that's what you want, yeah, absolutely do that. But they're so divisive. I mean, I noted the other day that was it Vance Jones, the commentator on CNN, he made some comment that 20,000 black men would rise up to defend Kamala Harris against insults. What? What's he talking about? You know, this isn't going to produce any unity. This is just going to further widen the divides that are already out there. This is going to inspire more hatred and conflict. And yes, Bobby Kennedy does not believe in that and doesn't want it. He's going to try and fight it. I think Donald Trump would like to reach across the aisle more and more, but right now I just don't see how he does that. He's so thoroughly hated and despised. And if he has the same crew with him that I see now, nothing will change. We'll get the same outcome. Let me say a couple of things. First of all, let's not lose sight of the fact that we have 3 areas where we can become dominant very, very quickly if we turn internally and invest in our capital infrastructure. So let me talk about those 3 things. One is agriculture. Agriculture is grossly underexploited, underfunded, developed in my view here inside the United States. We were once the world's breadbasket. We could become that again. I think it's in our interest to do so. So agriculture is a critical area. Secondly is energy. You know, good Lord, we're swimming in potential oceans of energy in this country. Mm-hmm. We can reverse that. Now, Bobby Kennedy is a strong advocate. He knows that. And he knows that whatever else we are doing, and no one is saying we should stop researching and developing alternative forms of energy, but he said we've got to exploit our energy advantage. We've got to build it up. So that's good news there. And obviously Donald Trump, who's never spoken about anything other than drill, 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 baby, at least he understands we've got to do that. That's good. Then there's another area where we've fallen behind, but we don't need to. I mean, we're listening to J.D. Vance, who appears to have been sponsored by Peter Thiel and others in Silicon Valley. Well, if you listen to Peter Thiel and you listen to...
There's 3 significant areas of untapped potential that could position us as global leaders if we refocus and invest internally in our capital infrastructure. Let's break them down. First, agriculture. Once the world's breadbasket, America has let this sector go woefully underfunded and underdeveloped. We could reclaim that status and make it a cornerstone of our economic strength. Second, energy. We're practically swimming in untapped oceans of energy. Bobby Kennedy Jr. has been an outspoken advocate for environmental protection, but even he acknowledges that the Green New Deal, as it stands, simply won't work. He's calling for a balanced approach, continuing to explore alternative energy while also leveraging our natural energy reserves to build a stronger foundation. And then there's Donald Trump, whose mantra has always been drill, 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 drill. At the very least, both seem to agree that exploiting our energy advantage is non-negotiable. The third area is advanced manufacturing. This is a sector where we should be leading the pack, yet we've fallen behind. The microchips that are central to the global economy, many of them produced in Taiwan, are proof of that. Why aren't we creating a home for such innovation here in the United States? The answer lies in developing our human capital. Right now, we're failing to identify and nurture the exceptional talent that can drive this sector forward. Instead, we've prioritized the bottom of the talent pool, ignoring the advice of experts who warned against this very approach. Here's the truth: rebuilding our infrastructure means making a tough choice. Do we rely on cheap labor, bringing in workers who may lack education and skills? Or do we invest in robotics and advanced manufacturing technologies? Cheap labor might offer short-term relief, but it's not a sustainable solution. What we're seeing with open borders is a workforce willing to take jobs at lower wages, sidelining Americans who could have filled those roles. That creates a ticking time bomb for the future. Finally, let's address the reality of human capital. In Washington, discussions often get bogged down by debates over identity, whether it's gender, race, or other factors, rather than focusing on intellectual capability and talent. That's a mistake. Brainpower is the cornerstone of innovation and progress, and it should be the driving force behind our policies. Right now, we're bringing in more people than we can effectively employ, and while they may find jobs, it's not a long-term solution. If anything, it exacerbates existing issues, and we're left with a crisis waiting to explode. This is an enormous challenge, and while people argue that mass deportation isn't feasible, the conversation about what to do next can't be ignored. Now, here's the reality: while mass deportation might seem unfeasible to some, there's another approach inducing self-deportation. How? By coming down hard on those who employ undocumented workers. The penalty should be severe enough to change behavior. But stepping back to the broader issue, why aren't we investing in our own country? It's simple: we're neglecting our human capital and critical infrastructure, focusing instead on short-sighted interests. Washington is consumed by self-interest driven by an incentive structure that prioritizes personal gain. If a lobbyist promises hefty donations that secure re-election, well, that's all that seems to matter. And let's not forget, many of these companies like Pfizer have facilities in key districts, making it all the easier for politicians to justify their inaction. The result? Corruption and self-serving policies dominate, benefiting the few while the rest of the nation suffers. Want proof? Just take a look around Washington, D.C., the 7 richest counties in the world. They all surround the nation's capital. Travel through Loudoun, Fairfax, or Montgomery counties, and you'll see sprawling mansions 7,000, 10,000, even 15,000 square feet. These aren't built from local industry, they're fueled by taxpayer dollars and borrowed money. And who's benefiting? The elite few, while the rest of the country is left behind. Wake up, America. Bobby Kennedy is the only presidential candidate even talking about this issue. Donald Trump, while well-meaning, isn't addressing it. He seems focused elsewhere. But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the facade of choice between Trump and his potential opponents. Here's the hard truth: in many cases, the same donors are funding both sides. If you're hoping for real, transformative change, you may be setting yourself up for disappointment. It's absurd. The only candidate daring to propose anything fundamentally different is Bobby Kennedy, and that's precisely why so many are working against him. This isn't just theory. I've seen it play out firsthand, both during my time in the military and during Donald Trump's presidency. When Trump first came onto the scene, he represented a seismic shift from the status quo. But that revolutionary edge, it's faded. What we see now is the status quo Trump, no longer the disruptor he once was. And this convergence of interests, this merging into a mainstream that leaves most Americans dissatisfied, is what I warn people about. Many say, oh, President Trump was great, everything was better when he was in office. So I ask them, did you personally benefit from the corporate tax breaks? And more often than not, their response is silence. It's time we have an honest conversation about who's really benefiting and who's being left behind. And here's where it gets interesting. When I ask people about these tax breaks, those same ones touted as game changers for the average American, they pause. I say, where did all that money go? The truth is, it flowed straight back to the oligarchs, the billionaires, and those sprawling estates in Loudoun County. These are the people shaping policy, the billionaires and their 100-millionaire enablers. And here's the problem. I see no indication that President Trump understands this entrenched paradigm or has any plans to dismantle it. As for Kamala Harris, we already know she's not going to touch it. Harris's strategy is clear. She'll appeal to marginalized groups, reinforcing the narrative that systemic oppression is why they're not wealthy or living in places like Loudoun County. It's an old, tired playbook. But let's face it, that message resonates and it'll bring voters to the polls. The sad part is it doesn't change anything. And does Harris even grasp the depth of these systemic issues? Think about it. Have you ever seen her engage in a meaningful, in-depth discussion about policy or national strategy? I haven't. Frankly, she reminds me of President Biden in that regard. A couple of years ago, there was this moment in the Oval Office, a revealing glimpse into how things are running. Biden was speaking when someone placed a document in front of him. He looked at it, confused, and asked, "What's this?" Kamala Harris leaned in, whispering just loudly enough for the audio to pick it up. "Just sign it," and he did. No questions, no hesitation, just a rubber stamp for whoever put that paper in front of him. And let's be honest, most of these executive orders Biden has signed since taking office, they're meaningless. He hasn't read them, doesn't know what's in them, and simply does what his advisors tell him to do. As long as they praise him, "You're doing great, Mr. President. You're our savior." He's content. He goes home, sleeps well, and doesn't ask questions. But here's the kicker. My fear is we could see the same dynamic under Donald Trump. If he doesn't surround himself with a team willing to challenge the system or engage deeply with policy, we're left with more of the same. And that's a scenario this country can't afford. President Trump has a glaring vulnerability, his love for being loved. And that's a problem. If you're leading a nation, being universally adored likely means you're not making the tough calls. True leadership often makes waves, not friends, especially in the Oval Office. What we need is a chief executive ready to shake things up, starting with over 500 appointed positions in Washington. We need fresh blood leaders unshackled from Ivy League echo chambers like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. The left loves to champion diversity, but what about diversity of thought, creativity, imagination? Bobby Kennedy seems to understand this, and it's a critical area where he stands apart. History offers lessons here. Think of Andrew Jackson. Back in the 1820s, Jackson faced a Washington run by his political enemies for 2 decades. His solution? He fired them all and brought in his people, outsiders with fresh perspectives. Yes, they shocked the establishment elites of the East Coast, but it worked. For context, Jackson was also the first U.S. president to speak without a British accent, signaling a shift toward distinctly American leadership. Fast forward to today, and the challenge is clear. We need someone to dismantle what's become an unwieldy, self-serving bureaucracy. Across government and military, bloated systems exist more to perpetuate themselves than to serve the people. Agencies like the Department of Agriculture, which made sense in 1900, now seem like feeding grounds for big corporations like Monsanto, often backed by massive firms like BlackRock. Why hasn't anyone addressed this? Where's the bold leadership of a Teddy Roosevelt to take on these corporate giants? Consider Amazon. Its monopolistic dominance begs for reform, yet nothing happens. Why? Money. Amazon pours its resources into lobbying lawmakers who, unsurprisingly, avoid rocking the boat. The same pattern exists in the military. Suggest reforming the Navy or Marine Corps, and critics quickly invoke patriotic nostalgia. They saved America. They're vital to the world, but here's the truth: nothing is permanent. Structures that made sense 80 years ago don't necessarily fit today's needs. Bold reorganization and modernization are essential. For an example of such a shift, consider post-Civil War Soviet Russia. In 1921, Lenin recognized their massive 6 million strong Red Army was obsolete, more symbolic than strategic. He slashed it to 600,000 troops, redirecting resources to industrialize and modernize. That decisive move fundamentally changed their trajectory. The United States faces a similar need for sweeping reform. Fiscal discipline must take center stage because the global lenders underwriting our national debt won't keep doing so without evidence of serious change. Without it, We're staring down a financial precipice. Now, who will lead this charge? Sadly, I don't hear this vision from President Trump. It sounds like more of the same. Kamala Harris, even less promising. That leaves us with the man in the middle, Bobby Kennedy, a candidate often dismissed as an underdog, but perhaps the only one truly speaking to the dramatic change this nation desperately needs. The candidate the mainstream media refuses to hear out. And let's face it, when the establishment collectively shuts the door, it might just mean he's onto something. Let's pivot to a concrete example of decisive action. Imagine this: Natalie Brunell wakes up tomorrow morning as President of the United States and decides to end the war in Ukraine. Step 1, suspend all military aid to Ukraine immediately. Step 2, withdraw every U.S. citizen military personnel or otherwise from Ukrainian soil. Then, Step 3, convene the NATO Council and make a groundbreaking announcement. From this point forward, the top NATO military commander will no longer be an American. That position, historically held by a U.S. general or admiral, will now belong to a European. These moves would send an unambiguous message: America is stepping back. This strategy wouldn't be about abandoning commitments overnight, but signaling a clear intent to reduce entanglements. It would also serve as an olive branch to Russia, an implicit but powerful message that the United States seeks an end to the conflict. Actions, not words, would restore credibility that's been eroded over years. Eastern Europe and Ukraine remain the world's most dangerous flashpoints, and ending this conflict is critical to avoiding an unnecessary and catastrophic confrontation between the U.S. and Russia. Now let's shift to the Middle East. A strong leader would draw a firm line with Israel, making it clear that while they're free to act as they see fit, the U.S. will not underwrite any plans for widespread destruction in southern Lebanon. Sending that signal to Prime Minister Netanyahu could deter dangerous regional escalation. Currently, the U.S. has taken the opposite approach, offering unconditional support, which risks enabling an already volatile situation. When a small nation with big ambitions pushes too far, it risks uniting all its neighbors against it. Israel's disdain for surrounding nations' relative military weakness could eventually backfire, leading to a regional war. And let's not forget the global stage. Russia, China, and much of Asia are keenly opposed to any conflict that could shut down the Straits of Hormuz, triggering economic chaos not just in Asia but across Europe and the U.S. And while all this unfolds abroad, what about our own borders? If the United States fails to secure its borders and restore the rule of law at home, the cost will be existential. This isn't hyperbole, folks. Without decisive leadership to address these critical issues, the very foundation of this nation is at risk. Without action, we face the unthinkable, the eventual collapse of the United States as we know it. Let's hope someone in power is ready to step up. It's a tough sell to convince people that stepping back from international affairs is in the best interest of the United States, but the truth is that meddling in the internal matters of other nations has proven to be costly. The reality, though, is that for much of our history up until the 20th century, common sense prevailed, and we largely avoided foreign entanglements. Unfortunately, our involvement in World War I set a dangerous precedent, leading us into an era where interventionism became a dangerous addiction. The second major issue we face is that many people in this country have lost their fear of war. To most Americans, war remains an abstract concept that happens far from our shores. But that mindset is about to be tested. If we continue to engage in military conflicts in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or potentially even Asia, war will eventually make its way to our doorstep. And when it does, it could come in many forms, ranging from direct attacks on our infrastructure to the possibility of long-range strikes against our population. Though we all hope for peace, there is a very real risk that this could escalate into something much worse, potentially involving nuclear warfare. While that remains a worst-case scenario, it's also important to acknowledge that our neighbors in places like Mexico and Central America could quickly descend into chaos as well. Mexico historically has never been a neutral player in terms of U.S. relations. Despite the warm ties we share with the Mexican people, Mexico as a nation has long been hostile to U.S. interests. This goes back to World War I, when Germany recognized Mexico as a potential weak spot on the U.S. border. The notion of Mexico as a vulnerable soft underbelly was prevalent throughout the 20th century. By World War II, Mexico became a hotbed of Soviet sympathies, and its largest KGB operation outside the Soviet Union was in Mexico City. Today it hosts groups like Hezbollah, ISIS, and various Chinese, Russian, and Iranian interests. This isn't just hypothetical. When Russian President Vladimir Putin warns that the United States can expect consequences for its actions abroad, this is what's known as horizontal escalation. If the U.S. continues to interfere in Ukraine or other regions, Russia has the capacity to turn the tables and stir trouble right at our southern border, Mexico being an obvious point of leverage. And it doesn't stop there. Cuba, Venezuela, and other nations hostile to U.S. interests could also act as threats in the region. For example, after Venezuela emptied its prisons, many of the released inmates found their way into the U.S., underscoring the vulnerabilities we face. The key takeaway here is that we are no longer living in a world where the United States can act with impunity. We're not the only global power anymore, and we're deeply vulnerable economically, strategically, and financially. If we don't regain control of our country and borders, if we don't restore the rule of law and remove individuals who don't belong here, the very future of this nation could be in jeopardy. The time to act is now, or we risk losing everything. Inside the United States, there are three distinct groups of people. First, there are those who are here illegally, individuals who have no legitimate claim to be in the country. Then you have what can be described as true Americans, people who, when asked who they are, would simply respond, "I'm an American. This is the heart and soul of the nation," the core group that defines America. Finally, there are others who may hold U.S. citizenship but don't identify with the country, and in many cases they even harbor disdain for it. Some of these individuals could potentially be brought into the fold, but we must recognize that we cannot guarantee their satisfaction with the outcome. We as a nation need to define ourselves first. Who are we as Americans, and how do we fit into the global landscape? The question remains, are we the self-proclaimed masters of the universe? The answer to that is no. From the very beginning, George Washington and our founding fathers made it clear that the United States did not seek to dominate the world. For over 120 years, we operated under the principle that we should not meddle in the affairs of others. That approach worked, and I believe it still can, but we must first answer those fundamental questions. What is in America's best interest? What is truly good for this nation? And we must recognize that war is rarely in the U.S. interest. It may serve a small minority of people like those who benefit from the military-industrial complex, but it does not benefit the American public. We need to make it clear to ourselves and the world what we stand for, where we fit in, and what we want to achieve. There is no need for inflated rhetoric about being the greatest country in the world and expecting others to follow our lead. I love my country and think it's a great nation, but that doesn't mean we should belittle or dismiss other countries. We need to return to the principle of respecting other nations, their cultures, and their ways of life. What we need now is to clearly define who we are and where we belong in the world, not as imperialists or overlords, but as a nation that leads by example. We shouldn't tell others what to do, but rather show them what we believe in and what we stand for. This conversation, unfortunately, isn't happening in Washington, D.C., but it is one that Americans must demand. Another vital step that Americans must take is to make their voices heard. Whether it's calling, emailing, or writing letters, citizens must demand accountability from their representatives. They need to clearly state, "I do not support war with Iran. I do not support war with Russia. I do not want to go to war with China." Remember, the primary concerns of those on Capitol Hill are staying in office and securing funding. So make them worry about their positions. Let them know that if they don't listen to their constituents, their tenure in office could be on the line. This kind of pressure worked before. I vividly recall how, in 2014, when President Barack Obama considered sending strike packages to Syria, the phones rang off the hook in Congress. Americans made it clear they didn't want another conflict, and as a result, Obama backed off. The power of the people is still there, it just needs to be exercised. When we look at the devastating conflict in Gaza, a localized but extremely volatile situation, and then consider the potential regional fallout, it's clear that we must tread carefully. The last thing we need is for this to escalate into broader conflicts in the Middle East or Eastern Europe. We've seen the consequences of war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and it's time to rethink our involvement in conflicts that don't directly serve the long-term interests of the United States.